Today, we're going to dive deep into the vineyard to figure out one of the most important decisions in all of winemaking. How in the world do you know when a red grape is perfectly ripe? It's a fascinating question that's part art, part science, and, maybe a little bit of magic.
Every time you open a bottle of amazing red wine, what you're really tasting is the result of 1,000 different choices. But honestly, it all boils down to one: the exact moment the winemaker decides, okay, it's time to pick. That single decision, right there in the vineyard, that's where it all begins.
Okay, so we all think we know what ripe means, right? It's sweet, it's juicy, easy. But for a wine grape, it is so much more complicated than that. So what does ripe really mean? Well, it's definitely not just about the sugar, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack.
So let's start with the classic way of doing things. For centuries, long before there were any fancy labs, winemakers had to rely on something way more personal, way more intuitive, their own senses. This is the true art of the harvest.
Just try to picture it. You're walking through the vineyard rows, and the only tools you have are what nature gave you: your eyes, your hands, your palate. That's it. This is how it was done for generations, and it created this really deep, intuitive connection between the grower and the grape.
So what are they actually looking for? Well, for one, the whole cluster starts to hang a little more loosely on the vine. The berries themselves will pop right off the stalk without a fight. The skin gets softer, more elastic, and when you give a grape a little squeeze, the pulp just slips right out. And here's a really crucial one. The seeds inside turn from green to a woody brown. That's a huge sign of maturity.
And believe it or not, it gets even more specific. There's this method from M. Ruiz Hernandez for analyzing the skins. You could call it the chew test. So you rinse the skins, then you chew them 3 times. The first chew, you just discard that impression. The second one, that's where you start to perceive the aromas. And the third chew is for evaluating the taste and, so important for red wine, the quality of those tannins.
Now, this whole sensory approach is incredible, right? But it's also really subjective. What if your palate is having an off day? What if you need some cold, hard data to back up that gut feeling? Well, that, of course, leads us to the next chapter of this story.
And that brings us to the science of the harvest. Now we're shifting gears and looking at ripeness by the numbers, using lab analysis to get a super precise picture of what's happening inside that tiny little grape.
So at its very core, ripening is this incredible balancing act, a tug of war, really, between 2 key things: sugars and acids. As the grape gets riper, the sugars go up, up, up. That's the fuel for the yeast during fermentation. At the very same time, the acids are dropping. The whole game is finding that perfect crossover point, that balance that gives a wine both its richness and its fresh, zippy structure.
The most classic measurement here is a simple sugar-to-acidity ratio. It just gives winemakers a quick, foundational look at that sweet versus sour balance. It's often the very first number they start tracking as harvest gets closer.
But of course, we can get way more detailed. See, not all sugars are created equal, so we can dig deeper and look at the glucose to fructose ratio. This tells us about the quality and composition of those sugars. Winemakers are often aiming for a value right around 0.95 to know they're perfectly developed. Now, on the other side of that equation, you've got the acids. The tartaric acid ratio is a big one. It tells us about the strength and quality of the wine's future backbone, since tartaric is the most stable and desirable acid you can have in a grape.
And the analysis can get even more nuanced. A more complex formula, like the Fourier maturation coefficient, goes a step further. It even accounts for the minerals in the grape that can kind of soften or buffer our perception of all that acidity. And finally, some indexes pull it all together. The Goodell Maturation Index, for example, combines a bunch of different factors, like the density of the juice and the total acidity, to give a more complete, holistic view of ripeness in a single number.
Okay, but for red wines, there's another layer to this that is absolutely 100% critical. It's called polyphenolic maturity. Now, this has nothing to do with sugar or acid. This is all about the ripeness of the tannins and the anthocyanins, the compounds that give red wine its structure, its beautiful deep color, and its ability to age for years and years.
All right, so now we have the art, the winemaker's intuition, the feel, the taste, and we have the science, all these data points. This brings us to the moment of truth, the point where art and science have to collide to make that final critical call.
And this right here is the winemaker's fundamental dilemma. You can see how the berry weight and the sugar content are peaking, but at the same time, the acids are dropping off. The point is, not everything matures in perfect sync, and that is the ultimate challenge of the harvest.
A quote from our source material just hits the nail on the head. It says the color compounds, the anthocyanins, often ripen right alongside the sugars in the pulp, but the tannins, they mature later. So do you pick when the sugar is perfect, or do you wait for those tannins to be perfect and risk everything else getting out of whack? That is the million-dollar question.
And this all leads to a really crucial point. There is no single perfect moment to pick. It all depends on the style of wine you're trying to make. If you want a fresh, zippy rosé, you're going to harvest earlier to keep that acidity high. But for a great reserve wine that's meant to age for decades, you'll wait much, much longer, letting those tannins soften and develop those complex notes of leather and tobacco.
So the winemakers made the call. The grapes are picked. But the work, the assessment, it doesn't stop there. Let's just quickly follow those grapes into the winery, where quality control kicks into high gear the second they arrive.
The instant that harvest hits the winery floor, it's a flurry of activity. They weigh the grapes, they note exactly which plot they came from, they check their sanitary state, is there any rot? They use a refractometer for a quick check on the probable alcohol. They make sure no unwanted leaves or stems are getting in. And finally, they pull a sample for a full, detailed lab analysis. This really sets the stage for the entire winemaking process.
So, we've seen the art of the senses and the precision of science all clashing and coming together in one single decision. It's this complex, beautiful dance of intuition and hard data. Which kind of leaves us with one final thought. The next time you open a bottle of red wine, just take a second. What story of that perfect moment, that perfect balance of art and science is it going to tell you?